At 5:58 in the morning, a flash of headlights was followed by a crash. The fourth mailbox was obliterated. This time, I decided against fixing it. Instead, I resolved to build a trap. From my window, I observed the black SUV reverse as if nothing had occurred. Behind the wheel was Rhonda Glass, the despot in pearls and pantsuits who had declared herself the queen of the HOA. She was completely unaware that she was tangling with an individual who engineers disasters for Hollywood and possesses the precise knowledge to bring them to life. And in Hollywood, we don't only craft things that break. On occasion, we craft things that break back. 3 months ago, I took possession of my grandparents' house on Willowbrook Court after inheriting the place. It is one of those idyllic suburban communities where all the residents know one another. White picket fences adorn the streets, and the homeowners association ensures that every single blade of grass adheres to their exacting standards. For the initial month, life was tranquil. I operated out of my garage, constructing props and mechanical effects for movie studios and appreciating the serene lifestyle my grandparents had always cherished. Then, Rhonda Glass swept into my life like a cyclone in a pantsuit. The initial mailbox incident occurred on a Monday morning in the beginning of September. I was awakened by the noise of metal scraping on concrete and hurried to my window just in time to witness a black SUV vanishing around the corner. My newly installed mailbox lay contorted on the sidewalk, resembling a pretzel fashioned from aluminum and regret. I assumed it was a teenager on a joyride or perhaps a driver distracted by their phone. Such things happen, after all. I spent the afternoon at the hardware store, purchased a replacement, and installed it myself. It was not a significant issue. Precisely half an hour after I completed the installation, Rhonda appeared. She knocked on my door with a look of concern and a polished gold badge that declared HOA president pinned to her blazer as if she were the sheriff of suburbia. She appeared to be around 40 years old, with blonde hair that seemed to have been styled with a leaf blower and a smile that failed to reach her eyes. Behind her stood a man with a nervous demeanor holding a clipboard, whom she introduced as Derek Moss, the HOA vice president. "Oh my goodness, Caleb, I was so sorry to hear about your mailbox. What a dreadful accident," she remarked, craning her neck to peer past me into my house. "I do hope you're not overly distressed. We've never had an incident like this in our neighborhood before. It's highly unusual." The way she emphasized unusual suggested that I had personally introduced turmoil into their immaculate world. She inquired about my work hours, whether I received many guests, and if I had any plans for renovations. "We just want to make sure new residents are aligned," she clarified with that synthetic smile. "Some people integrate seamlessly. Others require a bit of guidance." A fortnight later, the same event reoccurred. It was the same time, the same angle, and the same result of twisted metal. A pattern was beginning to emerge in my mind, but I convinced myself it was merely a string of bad luck. Perhaps an individual held a grudge against the prior homeowner. Or maybe a drunk driver followed the same path home from the bar every couple of weeks. I replaced the mailbox once more, this time adding a small security camera aimed at the street. It was a simple setup, just a basic device to identify the person responsible. During Rhonda's subsequent visit, her inquiries were more pointed, and her feigned sympathy had diminished. She was curious about the camera, questioning whether I had obtained HOA permission to install surveillance equipment. When I explained it was solely for protecting my property, she gave a slow nod, as if committing that piece of information to memory for future use. Of course. We all desire to feel secure. Just be mindful that cameras cannot be directed toward adjacent properties. Privacy holds great importance in our community. She then presented me with a copy of the HOA regulations. A substantial booklet that appeared to have been authored by lawyers who build by the word. On a brisk October morning, the third mailbox met its demise. This time, I was prepared. I observed from my bedroom window as the black SUV neared at precisely 5:58 a.m., decelerated just enough to align its trajectory, and then plowed directly into my mailbox with the accuracy of a guided missile. The collision sent metal fragments flying across my lawn, and I finally had an unobstructed view of the license plate. It was a perfect match for the SUV parked in the driveway of the largest house on the street, Rhonda Glass's residence. That day was spent analyzing my security footage and meticulously documenting my findings. The pattern was unmistakable. Every other Monday, at the same time, with the same deliberate aim. This was not an act of random vandalism or drunk driving. This was a personal, methodical campaign of harassment masked as a series of accidents. But what was the reason? I hardly knew the woman. We had perhaps exchanged words on 3 occasions, all of which had been perfectly civil. Then, the realization struck me like a ton of suburban bricks. During our first conversation, Rhonda had inquired if I was single, mentioned a coffee shop she favored, and proposed that we should get to know one another better. I had graciously declined, stating that I was concentrating on my work and settling in. Her smile had faltered for a fraction of a second before returning to its full intensity. After the third incident, when Rhonda stopped by, I observed her intently. She inspected the damage with the zeal of an art critic examining a masterpiece, capturing photographs from various angles for the HOA's records. She noted how these accidents seemed to exclusively befall my mailbox, never anyone else's, and recommended that I might think about relocating it to a more secure spot. When I mentioned that the mailbox had been in that exact location for 30 years under the previous owners without any problems, she simply shrugged. Sometimes, change can lead to unforeseen consequences, she stated before walking away. That evening, I found myself in my garage workshop, enveloped by the tools of my profession. In Hollywood, we construct items that appear authentic but are designed to break apart safely during stunts. We also fabricate items that seem delicate but are robust enough to withstand explosions. As I gazed at the heap of mailbox debris in the corner, I came to the conclusion that it was time to use my professional expertise to address a personal issue. Rhonda Glass wanted to engage in a demolition derby with my property. Very well. But she was on the verge of discovering that some things strike back with greater force than anticipated. I picked up a chip of black paint I had discovered lodged in the aluminum and held it up to the light. It was an exact match to her SUV's bumper. That evening, I opened my laptop and began to design. Not a mailbox, but a mousetrap. At 5:58 a.m. on Monday, I was at my bedroom window, coffee mug in hand, observing Rhonda's black SUV make its clockwork approach. She was oblivious to the fact that I was anticipating her arrival this time, with no inkling that I had been documenting every one of her accidents from multiple camera angles. The collision occurred just as I had foreseen. A deliberate approach, a brief halt to aim, followed by a full-speed acceleration into mailbox number 5. The sound of rending metal resonated through the slumbering neighborhood, and I saw her SUV reverse from the area like a hit-and-run driver escaping a crime scene. But this instance was different. This time, I had captured everything on video. The footage was crystal clear, showing Rhonda Glass, HOA president and self-proclaimed neighborhood autocrat, intentionally demolishing my property with the precision of someone who had done this many times before. I had her license plate, her face visible through the windshield, and the unmistakable demeanor of someone who believed they were beyond reproach. She was about to find out just how mistaken she was. Half an hour later, as expected, she was knocking on my door. This time, she didn't trouble herself with bringing Derek or feigning a concerned citizen's expression. She stood on my porch as if she owned it, her gold HOA badge gleaming in the morning light, her blonde hair impeccably styled despite the early hour. "Caleb, honey, we need to talk," she declared, brushing past me into my living room without an invitation. "This situation with your mailbox is becoming quite concerning." "Concerning in what way?" I inquired, genuinely intrigued to see how this would unfold. She positioned herself on my couch as if presiding over a court, adjusting her blazer and fixing me with a gaze that likely worked on her past victims. "Well, sweetie, this neighborhood has standards, certain expectations. Some neighbors adapt, but others require correction." Her voice had the cadence of someone accustomed to being obeyed without argument. She questioned me about my work schedule with the tenacity of an interrogator. Did I work from home? How frequently did I receive deliveries? Were clients visiting the house? Did I realize that home-based businesses needed special permits? The thing is, Caleb, Derek, and I have duties to this community. We maintain this place as nice and orderly, safe for families. We can't have residents who fail to respect the rules we've all consented to. I observed her delivery of this little speech, identifying it as a threat veiled in suburban courtesy. She was asserting her dominance, defining her territory, and communicating that my peaceful life in my grandparents' house was entirely contingent on her sanction. The woman had refined HOA tyranny into an art form and was clearly proud of her work. But she had no idea she was intimidating someone who spent his days constructing traps for movie antagonists. When she concluded her speech about community standards and mutual respect, I nodded with a thoughtful expression. "You know what, Rhonda, you are absolutely right. Standards are vital. Consistency is key. People should receive precisely what they are due." A shift in my tone gave her a moment's pause, but she quickly rebounded, flashing that artificial smile as she rose to depart. "I'm so glad we understand each other," she said, making her way to the door. "Oh, and Caleb, you might want to consider moving that mailbox to a safer location. These accidents seem to happen only to yours, and we wouldn't want someone to get hurt." The casual malice in her voice was stunning. She was openly confessing to the destruction while also threatening to escalate matters if I did not yield to her unspoken wishes. Following her departure, I dedicated the morning to examining the HOA regulations she had provided. It was a tour de force of bureaucratic jargon, crafted to grant the board unrestricted authority over the residents' lives. Ambiguous terms like community standards and aesthetic harmony could be interpreted in any manner the leadership saw fit. Grass was not to be taller than 3 inches. Paint colors had to be approved neutral shades. There were to be no unauthorized signs, no alterations without consent, and no activities that could disrupt the peaceful enjoyment of others. I phoned my neighbor, Betty Chambers, a 70-year-old widow who had become my unofficial source on neighborhood dynamics. "Oh, honey," she cautioned when I recounted my conversation with Rhonda, "you must be careful. That woman has compelled 3 families to leave in the last 2 years. The Johnsons, the Rodriguez family, and that lovely young couple with the twin babies. She discovers violations everywhere, accumulating fines until people can no longer afford to live here." Betty asked me to come over for coffee and presented her own assortment of violation notices, 23 of them, each for an increasingly absurd offense. Grass supposedly too high, measured to the fraction of an inch. Garden flowers that were allegedly non-compliant species. Her American flag was apparently not displayed correctly. Each infraction was accompanied by fines that varied from $75 to $300, and they accrued more rapidly than anyone could feasibly rectify. "She targets anyone who doesn't immediately submit to her authority," Betty clarified, producing a folder dense with paperwork. "New residents are tested first. If you pass her submission test, she leaves you be. If you exhibit any hint of independence or resilience, she methodically wears you down until you have no alternative but to move." She showed me pictures of the other families who had been targeted, all of whom had made the mistake of questioning Rhonda's authority in some minor fashion. That same afternoon, Rhonda initiated her first official action against me. Derek Moss materialized at my door with his clipboard and the same anxious expression he always had around his superior. He gave me a yellow violation notice, penned in formal, bureaucratic prose that essentially stated, my grass was 3.2 inches tall instead of the regulation 3-inch maximum. The penalty was $75, due within 48 hours. That evening, I measured my grass with a ruler and discovered it was the exact same height as every other lawn on the street, yet only mine had been cited. As I walked through the neighborhood taking pictures for evidence, I saw Rhonda observing me from her window, likely devising her next move in this strange game of suburban chess. The notice of violation was on vibrant yellow paper and displayed prominently on my front door, like a medieval proclamation of my offenses. Other residents passed by, avoiding my gaze, likely relieved that they weren't the current focus of Rhonda's scrutiny. The intention was clear: submit or be vanquished. That evening in my workshop, I contemplated the growing stack of mailbox fragments and Betty's words. 3 families had been driven from their homes by a woman intoxicated by the minimal authority an HOA presidency provided. How many more would be next if she wasn't challenged? How many of my neighbors were living in a state of fear, treading carefully, worried about planting the wrong type of flower or painting their shutters an unapproved shade of white? Watching Rhonda affix that yellow paper to my door like some ancient decree, I finally understood. This was not about mailboxes. It was about control. The yellow notices began materializing on my door with predictable regularity. Every Tuesday morning, Derek Moss would appear with his clipboard and anxious smile, affixing another violation notice as Rhonda oversaw the operation from her SUV parked on the opposite side of the street. It was a form of psychological warfare cloaked in municipal bureaucracy, and they had perfected it. By the conclusion of the second week, my front door resembled a bulletin board at a crime scene. 5 violation slips arrived in a single morning. Unapproved paint, grass 0.2 inches too high, aggressive parking posture, suspicious tool usage, and the timeless failure to comply with community aesthetics. Rhonda was no longer maintaining any pretense. This was a siege. By the 3rd week, their creativity was on full display. Vehicle positioning creates sightline obstruction for pedestrian safety. My car, which was legally parked in my own driveway exactly where my grandparents had parked theirs for 3 decades, was now deemed a community hazard. The fine was $200. Following that was excessive noise during permitted hours because I had been using power tools in my garage workshop within the clearly specified time frame for such activities, resulting in a $300 fine. The noise complaint was especially notable since I had been constructing a whisper-quiet jewelry box for a romantic comedy when Derek came to my door. I began to document every detail with the meticulousness of a special effects professional. I took photos, noted timestamps, took measurements, and made recordings. I had comparison images demonstrating that my grass was the same height as my neighbor's, paint swatches confirming my white was identical to that of approved houses, and decibel meter readings from my workshop that were lower than a typical conversation. None of this made a difference. Rhonda had transformed the HOA regulations into a tool for personal vendettas, and she was only just beginning. The psychological campaign was impressively efficient. Each morning, I would inspect my front door to see if a new yellow notice had materialized overnight, like some sort of bureaucratic scarlet letter. Neighbors started to avert their eyes when they passed, likely thankful they were not in Rhonda's sights, but also concerned that offering me any form of support might make them her next victim. The sense of isolation was deliberate and potent. One afternoon, Betty Chambers passed me a note. "She's been driving by your house 6 times a day taking pictures. She did the same thing to the Martinez family before she forced them out. Be careful." I started to log Rhonda's surveillance patterns and found she was treating my home like a military objective, documenting every aspect and searching for new avenues of attack. My initial attempt to retaliate was discreet and technically compliant with the law. I placed a sign on my front lawn that declared, "Area under HOA surveillance," complete with official-looking icons and fine print regarding monitoring equipment. It was factually correct, aesthetically unassuming, and entirely in line with the regulations I had thoroughly reviewed. Rhonda's response was immediate and extreme. Derek was at my door within 2 hours, perspiring more heavily than usual and holding a violation notice that was practically steaming. Unauthorized signage displaying non-approved messaging creates community discord. The fine was $500. When I argued that the sign adhered to all specified criteria, Derek actually seemed to feel sorry for me. Rhonda says the intent is clearly confrontational, which violates the community harmony clause. That night, for the first time, Rhonda telephoned me personally. Her voice was professionally frigid, with an undercurrent of barely suppressed rage. "Caleb, sweetie, I believe we need to get something straight. This community has rules for a purpose. When residents believe they are more clever than the system, when they presume they can outwit individuals who have been upholding these standards for years, well, that is when matters become complicated." She paused, allowing the threat to register. "Your current total for violations is $1,200. That might appear to be a substantial amount, but believe me, it can increase significantly if we continue to play these little games." I ended the call and did some quick calculations. In 3 weeks, Rhonda had fabricated over $1,000 in fines for infractions that were purely imaginary. At this pace, she would have a basis to put a lien on my house within 2 months. I called Betty to inquire about the families who had been driven out, and the narrative was consistently the same. Escalating violations, accumulating fines, and unachievable deadlines, until selling the house was the only financially sound choice. The following morning delivered the 6th violation: landscaping placement within prohibited setback zone. The memorial flower garden that my grandparents had planted 30 years prior was now suddenly deemed too close to the street. The fine was $750, plus the compulsory removal of all non-compliant plants within 72 hours. This one felt different. This was personal. I passed that afternoon in the garden my grandparents had so lovingly cultivated, measuring distances and consulting old property surveys. These weren't merely flowers. They were Sundays spent with my grandmother, kneeling in the soil, and my grandfather humming as he set the stepping stones. To see Rhonda crush them felt like watching memories go up in flames. But Rhonda had no interest in history or legality. She was focused on breaking my spirit. When Derek arrived the next day to present the 7th violation, excessive garage utilization for non-residential purposes, I posed a direct question to him. "Derek, do you honestly think any of these violations are valid?" He glanced around anxiously, as if Rhonda might be concealed in the shrubbery with a recorder. "Look, man, I just do what she tells me. I need this position on my resume for the city council job I'm applying for. Rhonda has connections. That evening, in my workshop, I tallied the financial damage, $1,550 in fines, with more arriving every few days. Rhonda had issued an ultimatum: pay in a week or contend with escalated enforcement actions, which likely meant a lien on the house. She had done this before, refined the process, and converted it into a mechanism for crushing anyone who challenged her power. But she had made a crucial error. She had no idea who she was up against. In my profession, I don't just construct things that break. I build things that appear breakable, but then astonish everyone by being far stronger than imagined. And I was on the verge of using those skills for a very particular project. Facing $1,500 in penalties for having ordinary grass and white paint, I reached a resolution. If Rhonda desired a tough contest, so be it. She was about to discover that my profession specializes in creations that retaliate. The memorial garden had been my grandparents' pride and joy. Every spring, my grandmother would devote hours to caring for the roses they had planted together. It was the result of 30 years of meticulous work, creating something beautiful for the entire neighborhood to appreciate. My grandfather had personally laid each stepping stone, forming gentle walkways through the flower beds so that people could stroll through and admire the various types of flowers. It stood as a symbol of their affection for one another and their dedication to enhancing their small part of the world. Rhonda obliterated it on a Thursday morning in November. I observed from my kitchen window as she showed up with Derek, both of them equipped with measuring tapes and clipboards, as if they were performing some sort of official inspection. She marched directly into the garden with her most professional demeanor, gesturing at different plants while Derek took notes. And then she started to systematically crush the flower beds underfoot. It wasn't accidental or due to awkwardness. With calculated and methodical accuracy, she destroyed the antique roses that had withstood 3 decades of Michigan winters. She displaced the memorial stones my grandfather had set to commemorate their wedding anniversary. She crushed daffodil bulbs into the soil with her designer shoes, all while Derek recorded the property line infractions she was supposedly finding. When I rushed out to challenge them, she glanced up from the devastation with the same artificial smile she had worn at our initial meeting. "Oh, Caleb, we're just conducting the mandatory inspection I mentioned in your violation notice. These plantings are clearly within the prohibited setback zone, which is a serious safety issue for emergency vehicles." She gestured at the trampled roses as if they were hazardous materials. "I know it's disappointing, but regulations exist for everyone's protection." The casual malice in her voice was stunning. She was annihilating 30 years of love and dedication while giving me a lecture on community safety. I knelt down amidst the ruined flowers, my hands trembling with rage as I gathered the fragments of broken memorial stones. That night, I gazed at the garden from my window, unable to find sleep. I opened a new browser tab to research how one might surrender a house to an HOA. I even composed a draft of a letter renouncing my ownership of the property. I was exhausted, defeated. Rhonda had not merely destroyed a garden. She had torn out the final piece of home I had remaining. Then, I noticed it, my grandfather's old gardening book, untouched on the shelf. I opened it to a dog-eared and faded page. Tucked between 2 fragile leaves was a note in his handwriting. It read, "We don't plant roses for today. We plant them so someone else can sit in the shade tomorrow." I sat down on the floor, and for the first time since this conflict began, I wept. Not from a loss of hope, but from remembering why I had started this fight. "These roses were 30 years old," I said, my voice barely steady. "My grandparents planted them together. They've been here longer than half the houses in this neighborhood." Rhonda simply shrugged, already completing another violation form. "Property violations don't get exceptions for sentiment, honey. Rules are rules." For the first time since I had met him, Derek looked genuinely uneasy. He kept looking from the ravaged garden to Rhonda, then back to his clipboard, as if trying to vanish into the paperwork. When I asked him point-blank if he believed this was necessary, he muttered something about adhering to established protocols and would not meet my eyes. The man was a coward, but he at least recognized that what they were doing was wrong. For landscaping violations, plus immediate removal of all non-compliant vegetation, Rhonda declared, handing me another yellow notice. "You have 72 hours to clear everything and resod with approved ground cover." Failure to comply will result in additional fines and possible legal action. She looked over the destruction with a sense of accomplishment, like a painter admiring her finished work. That afternoon, Betty Chambers came over, her eyes filled with tears. She had seen the entire incident from her window and had recorded it on her phone. "Honey, she's gone too far this time. That garden was registered with the Neighborhood Historical Society. Your grandmother used to give tours to garden club members from 3 different counties. Everyone adored those roses." Betty showed me the video she had recorded, clear footage of Rhonda intentionally destroying plants while pretending to measure property lines. I passed the evening in the ruins of my grandparents' garden, attempting to save what I could. Some of the bulbs might pull through if I replanted them promptly. A few rose bushes could possibly be salvaged if I pruned them drastically and hoped for a recovery. But 30 years of dedicated care, of shared memories and peaceful Sunday mornings spent weeding side by side, had vanished forever because one woman could not stand for anyone to exist beyond her sphere of influence. The total of the violations had climbed to $2,300. Rhonda had presented me with a final demand: pay the full amount within 7 days or prepare for foreclosure proceedings. She had been through this routine before, knowing exactly how to push people beyond their limits, how to make the cost of fighting higher than the cost of leaving without a fuss. But she had made a serious miscalculation this time. I called in sick to work and devoted the next 3 days to my garage workshop, creating something unique. It wasn't just a replacement for the mailbox, but a declaration, a definitive line, a trap disguised as capitulation. I drew up plans, figured out load-bearing needs, and ordered materials from vendors that specialized in Hollywood-grade construction. If Rhonda wanted to intensify this conflict, I was prepared to offer her a confrontation she would never forget. The neighbors had now started to shun me entirely, too fearful of becoming Rhonda's next victim to offer any kindness or assistance. I couldn't hold it against them. They had seen 3 families ruined by this woman's methodical campaign of harassment. They understood precisely what befell those who challenged her, and they had their own families to safeguard. Yet their lack of action was also a form of complicity, which made Rhonda's authority appear unchallengeable. On Sunday evening, I stood in the remnants of my grandparents' garden and made a vow to their memory. I reflected on all the Sunday afternoons we had passed there together, my grandmother teaching me about different types of roses while my grandfather explained how good drainage prevents root decay. They had created something lovely that brought happiness to a whole community, and Rhonda had demolished it for no reason other than to assert her dominance. Betty came to my door that night with a plate of homemade cookies and a folder brimming with documents. "I've been keeping records on Rhonda for 2 years," she stated softly. "Every violation notice, every family she's targeted, every abuse of power. I was waiting for someone brave enough to fight back." She gave me the folder with trembling hands. "That garden meant everything to your grandparents. Don't let her win." Gazing at the crushed roses in the moonlight, I made a promise to my grandfather's memory. Rhonda Glass has intimidated her last neighbor. Sunday night was designated for strategy. I laid out blueprints on my workbench like a general getting ready for a showdown, figuring out stress capacities and impact durability while the rest of Willowbrook Court was sound asleep. In Hollywood, we construct 2 types of props: those meant to break in a spectacular fashion and those meant to withstand explosions. I was on the verge of building the ultimate version of the latter. The base needed significant engineering: a 4-foot-deep foundation of steel-reinforced concrete, engineered to secure something much heavier than a standard mailbox. I had to work in stages during Derek's lunch breaks and Rhonda's afternoon outings, camouflaging the work as routine landscaping maintenance. My neighbors likely assumed I was finally submitting to the violation notices, correcting the property line problems by putting in new edgings. The mailbox itself appeared to meet all HOA standards in terms of height, color, and positioning. I even printed the local regulations and double-checked every dimension. On the surface, it was flawless. In truth, it was an unyielding object awaiting its inevitable collision. From the street, it appeared identical to all the other mailboxes on Willowbrook Court, with standard aluminum construction, regulation height, and approved suburban design. However, concealed within that harmless-looking shell was a solid steel core, anchored to that concrete foundation with enough force to halt a small truck. The entire structure was engineered to take a massive hit without sustaining even a minor dent. Rhonda's surveillance routine made the job difficult, but not insurmountable. She drove past 6 times a day like a machine, slowing down to capture photos of any alterations to my property. I organized my construction schedule around her movements, working in my garage during her lunch break and setting up parts after sunset when she was securely at home watching her evening shows. Derek delivered his daily violation notices at exactly 10 a.m., so I planned concrete pours for 10:30. The camera setup demanded greater finesse, involving multiple perspectives, concealed placements, and wireless feeds to backup storage systems. I was determined to have every moment of the impending impact recorded from various viewpoints, forming an unassailable record of events that not even Rhonda's talent for creative interpretation could challenge. Betty volunteered to assist by placing extra recording devices in her window, establishing a thorough surveillance grid. By the middle of the week, Rhonda's suspicion had escalated significantly. She began to make additional drive-bys, at times parking across the street for 20 minutes to observe my house with binoculars. During one of his violation deliveries, Derek mentioned that Rhonda was worried about unapproved construction, but all my permits were valid, and my work was technically just landscaping and mailbox upkeep. The psychological strain was unceasing. Fresh violations materialized every day: excessive tool noise during prohibited hours, unauthorized storage of materials, and construction waste causing visual pollution. Each notice was accompanied by higher fines and tighter deadlines. Rhonda was quickening her pace, likely detecting that I was up to something and aiming to crush me before I could execute my plan. Thursday delivered the greatest indignity: a violation for a memorial display without proper permits. Apparently, the small stone I had placed in remembrance of my grandparents' demolished garden was now a breach of code, demanding a $300 permit and monthly inspections. The woman had no decency, no boundaries, and no acknowledgement that she was methodically ruining lives for her own amusement. I put the last pieces in place on Friday night, working under the moonlight to position the final hidden cameras and check the wireless transmission. The fortress mailbox looked just like its predecessors from a distance: harmless, exposed, an easy mark for someone intoxicated with suburban authority. But hidden beneath that misleading surface was enough engineering to endure a direct collision from Rhonda's large SUV. Betty stood guard during the setup, giving an occasional signal when she saw headlights approaching. She had unofficially become my collaborator in this endeavor, the only neighbor with the courage to actively aid the opposition to Rhonda's despotism. "That woman has held this community in fear for too long," she murmured as I fine-tuned the camera angles. "Someone has to teach her that there are consequences for her actions." Saturday morning brought Rhonda's final demand, which she delivered in person instead of through Derek's usual anxious visits. She stood on my porch with her most authoritative look, the gold HOA badge on her blazer catching the morning sun like a sheriff's badge. "Caleb, sweetie, your current total for violations is $3,200. Payment is required by Monday morning, or we will begin foreclosure proceedings. I truly hope you will opt for the wise choice." I looked at her, standing there before the house my grandparents had adored, amidst the devastation of their memorial garden, threatening to seize everything they had built because I had not submitted to her will. "You know what, Rhonda? I believe Monday morning will be quite an eye-opener for both of us." Something in my voice gave her a moment of hesitation, but she quickly masked it with that synthetic smile. "I'm pleased you're finally prepared to be sensible," she said, turning to depart. "Just keep in mind, this community has standards for a reason. Those who can't adjust to our lifestyle typically find it more convenient to move to a place that better suits their nature." The casual self-importance was astounding. She truly thought she was invulnerable, that her small dominion would endure indefinitely. On Sunday night, at 11:47 p.m., the trap was ready. Tomorrow at 5:58 a.m., Rhonda Glass would drive straight into her fate. And this time, the entire neighborhood would be there to see the unstoppable force collide with the immovable object. On Monday morning at 5:57 a.m., I was at my bedroom window, a cup of coffee in one hand and my phone recording in the other, observing the peaceful street that was about to turn into a scene of an incident. Across the way, Betty was in position at her window, her own recording device poised and her internet live stream already active for the dozen followers she had acquired over the weekend. The concealed cameras were set and prepared, with motion sensors ready to record every aspect of the event about to happen. The sound was the first indication, the distinct growl of Rhonda's large SUV engine getting progressively louder as she neared her objective. Right on cue, just as she had for the last 2 months, She drove toward my mailbox with the assurance of someone who considered herself completely beyond reproach. She decelerated slightly as she got closer, lining up her trajectory with practiced skill, then sped up toward the point of collision with 25 miles per hour of suburban aggression. The impact was breathtaking. Physics collided with engineering in a crescendo of mangled metal and deploying safety features that could be heard 3 blocks away. Rhonda's SUV struck my fortress mailbox with enough power to obliterate a standard one. But instead of the usual sense of destructive triumph, she encountered something entirely unexpected. The SUV collided with it like a freight train, yet the mailbox remained completely unmoved. Her vehicle wrapped around it as if it had struck a lamppost constructed of defiance and steel. It didn't buckle, quiver, or sustain even a minor scuff. It stood there like a tribute to solid engineering while her vehicle crumpled around it like an accordion fashioned from steel and regret. The hood buckled instantly, and steam billowed from the demolished radiator as airbags inflated throughout the cabin. The force of the collision pushed the engine block back into the firewall, turning Rhonda's instrument of suburban intimidation into a smoldering heap of automotive debris. Glass rained down on the pavement like tiny jewels, and various liquids started to form puddles beneath the wreckage, creating shimmering rainbows of mechanical failure. Rhonda sat stunned, an airbag in her face, her hair standing on end as if from an electric shock. In front of her, the fortress mailbox shone in the morning light, untouched, triumphant, and perfectly legal. Through her broken windshield, she gazed at my mailbox with an expression of utter disbelief, as if the very principles of physics had personally betrayed her. The fortress remained flawless and unscathed, its aluminum surface gleaming in the morning sun. As if it were posing for a victory shot, I walked out of my house with composure, still filming with my phone, enjoying every moment of this flawless turnaround. Behind me, Betty came out of her house, informing her live stream viewers that they were seeing justice unfold in real time and encouraging them to share the video with anyone who had ever had to deal with a domineering HOA president. Within a few minutes, neighbors started to come out onto their porches and driveways, phones out, capturing the scene. "What? How is this possible?" Rhonda managed to say as she got out of her wrecked car. "This mailbox is illegal. You framed me. This is a trap." Her voice was filled with panic as she saw that dozens of people were recording her breakdown from every conceivable direction. The woman who had instilled fear in an entire neighborhood was now facing the repercussions of her actions, and she was clearly at a loss as to how to react. "Actually, Rhonda, it's just really well built," I responded with composure, continuing to record as she stood amidst the remnants of her intimidation tactics. "I employ sound engineering principles and high-quality materials. Standards." The irony was not lost on either of us. She had lectured me for months about community standards while methodically disregarding every principle of human decency. Derek showed up just as Rhonda's meltdown was hitting its peak, took one look at the situation, and promptly began to walk away. The man wasn't courageous, but he wasn't a fool either. He could see the writing on the wall, and it indicated that his connection to Rhonda's reign of terror was about to become a major problem. Within a few hours, he would step down from the HOA board and disavow any support for her campaigns of harassment. "Everyone, stop recording," Rhonda yelled, turning in circles as she attempted to confront all the cameras at once. "This is private property. You can't film me without permission." But we were on a public road, documenting what looked like a traffic accident, and her protests only served to make her appear more irrational. Several neighbors who had never exchanged a word with me before came forward to give witness statements and provide extra video footage. Betty's live stream was gaining viewers faster than she could keep up. Comments were pouring in from people recounting their own HOA ordeals, celebrating the mailbox justice, and requesting the technical details of the fortress's construction. The hashtag mailbox revenge began to trend in our city within the first hour, and local news outlets started to contact us for interviews. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Multiple camera angles revealing deliberate targeting, systematic property damage, and now the spectacular fallout from Rhonda's own actions. She had orchestrated a perfect record of her own undoing, complete with witnesses, recordings, and a smoldering heap of automotive proof that no amount of creative explanation could dismiss. "You know what, Rhonda?" I said as emergency services started to arrive to manage the wreckage. "I never wanted this fight. I just wanted to live in peace in my grandparents' house. You initiated this with the first mailbox. I'm simply bringing it to a close." The woman who had demolished 30-year-old memorial gardens and driven families from their homes was now up against someone who would not be intimidated. As the tow truck prepared to haul away Rhonda's mangled SUV, I had a beautiful realization. For the first time in months, the neighborhood was completely quiet. There was no sound of engines, no threats, no fear, just the sound of justice being delivered with a side of twisted metal. The video became a viral sensation within 6 hours. Betty's live stream, my own phone footage, and clips from a dozen other neighbors combined to create a thorough documentary of Rhonda's stunning collapse, which spread rapidly across social media. Messages flooded in from individuals recounting their own HOA nightmares, applauding the mailbox justice, and requesting detailed building plans. By evening, local news channels had picked up the story, featuring segments with titles like HOA President's Mailbox Meltdown and Suburban Justice Served. Within 48 hours, Rhonda's insurance company rejected her claim. Intentionally driving a vehicle into a fixed object was not a scenario covered by any policy they had ever issued, and the video evidence made their decision straightforward. She was now confronted with the complete loss of her vehicle, medical expenses from airbag-related injuries, and the increasing likelihood of civil lawsuits from every family she had previously tormented. Her empire was collapsing more quickly than the front end of her SUV. An emergency neighborhood meeting was scheduled for a Friday evening, and the community center had not seen such a large turnout since the 1980s. Residents who had been cowed into silence for years finally felt secure enough to speak out about Rhonda's methodical abuse of authority. Betty presented her meticulously compiled evidence of harassment campaigns, demonstrating the recurring pattern of targeted infractions, mounting fines, and forced moves that had expelled 3 previous families. She fined us $2,000 for having the wrong color mailbox, testified a member of the Williams family, who had painted their mailbox the exact same shade of blue as 4 other houses on their street. When we pointed out the identical colors, she claimed ours was aggressively blue and threatened foreclosure if we didn't pay within a week. Similar accounts came from all parts of the room, depicting a consistent strategy of intimidation masked as community management. The Martinez family had been compelled to remove a 50-year-old oak tree because Rhonda asserted it breached sightline rules, even though it had been there for decades before the subdivision was built. The Johnsons had lost their home due to supposed excessive children's noise violations when their twin toddlers played in their own backyard during allowed hours. Every narrative followed the same sequence: fabricated violations, increasing pressure, and financial ruin. Rhonda made one last-ditch effort to keep her power. She came to the meeting with a briefcase filled with legal papers and threats. She argued that I had constructed an illegal booby trap intended to injure her, and she called for investigations into conspiracy and property damage. Her performance was a spectacular display of desperation, but the room filled with her former victims was no longer swayed. They had seen the truth, and the powerful figure was just a petty dictator with a gold badge. The vote of no confidence was unanimous. 47 households voted to immediately oust Rhonda from all her HOA roles, strip her of the power to issue violations, and appoint new leaders committed to genuine community service rather than personal gain. Derek had already tendered his resignation by email, mentioning philosophical disagreements with the current board's direction and a sudden desire to concentrate on his city council run. Betty Chambers was elected as the new HOA president by a unanimous vote, pledging to manage the organization with common sense and for the real benefit of the community. Her initial official action was to nullify every violation notice Rhonda had issued in the preceding 2 years, canceling all related fines and creating an appeals system for residents who believed they had been treated unjustly. The change was swift and profound. Within a month, Rhonda's house was on the market. She was unable to afford to live there without a car, and her social exclusion was absolute. Her former supporters kept their distance. Neighbors would cross the street to evade her, and the local supermarket had banned her after she berated teenage cashiers about conspiracy theories. She had turned into an outcast in the very community she once dominated through fear. That mailbox is now more than just steel. It stands as evidence that when you establish deep roots and build with strength, no despot, regardless of the gleam of their badge, can demolish what is right. Children would ask their parents about the renowned mailbox that stood up for itself, and new residents would make special requests for a look at the engineering feat that brought an end to a tyrant's rule. I began receiving inquiries from other neighborhoods for advice on defensive landscaping and anti-Karen infrastructure. It seemed my experience had sparked a movement. 6 months later, as I was tending to my restored memorial garden, a young family with 2 small children came to my door. They had recently moved into Rhonda's former house and were eager to meet the local hero who had freed their new community from suburban oppression. Their children were immediately drawn to the fortress mailbox, asking detailed questions about its construction and ability to withstand impact. "Can you teach us how to build one?" the father inquired, pointing to my masterpiece of engineering. Our previous neighborhood had an HOA president who made Rhonda seem like a reasonable person, and we want to be ready if that happens again. I came to understand that Rhonda's legacy would not be the fear and intimidation she had cultivated, but rather a community that was now skilled in confronting bullies and constructing things sturdy enough to endure their assaults. Betty's new HOA board concentrated on genuine community betterment, putting together block parties, tending to common grounds, and resolving neighbor conflicts with practical wisdom instead of violation notices. For the first time in 3 years, property values began to rise. Families with children started to move in, rather than escape, and Willowbrook Court transformed into the kind of neighborhood my grandparents had always imagined. I still begin most of my mornings with a cup of coffee by my bedroom window, but now I watch children walking safely to school instead of scanning for potential suburban threats. The memorial garden blossoms again every spring, visited by neighbors who cherish the memory of my grandparents and the tale of perseverance it embodies. Sometimes, justice doesn't arrive quietly. Sometimes, it comes with the satisfying sound of crumpling metal and the sight of a bully finally receiving their just desserts. The fortress mailbox continues to protect our tranquil street, its surface gleaming in the morning sun, a lasting testament that bullies hold power only as long as good people choose to stay quiet. And in our neighborhood, the era of silence has officially come to an end.